So again, I'm Tomasso Groenendijk, and I'm from the Netherlands. I'm going to do a presentation about implementing a real-life scenario for the API economy. And basically, I'm going to talk about how to make money with your API. So first, a small question. Who works for a company that has an API and really is charging money for their API? So that's not a lot. So I think this is a very important session. So first, let's do a small introduction about myself. So I live in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam, and I work for a company called Motion 10. And Motion 10 is specialized in BizTalk, SharePoint, and BI. And I became an integration MVP in 2014. I write a lot of blog posts about BizTalk, and in the past also about ESB Toolkit. And now I'm focusing more and more on Azure because you have a lot of new and exciting functionality out there. So first an overview, what we're going to talk about. What I'm going to do is, first I'm going to talk about how to create a website with a web app, and then I'm going to talk about API management, and I'm going to integrate these two with each other. And I'm going to do that with delegation. So Wednesday, my flight was cancelled, so I didn't see the session of Vladimir. So probably already shown this slide. I'm going to walk through very briefly. So below you see the publisher portal, and with the publisher portal, an administrator can publish an API, put restrictions on it, do all kinds of neat stuff with it. And in the middle you have the gateway. So every time when a request from an application goes to the API, it has to go to the gateway. And on top of it, you have the developer portal. And that's what I'm going to focus on in this session. Because with the developer portal, a developer can subscribe to an API, he can test an API, and he can log in and subscribe to products. And that you got all out of the box. So that's really nice. But what if you already have a website? And on your website, people can create users. Or for example, what if you want to add payment for your API? And these are important questions because a customer of us really had those questions. They want to charge money for the API. So yeah, how can you do that? Now, of course, you can do that, but it's not out of the box. And you have to do a couple of things. And then you get something like this. So first you have to create your website, your own website. And you can do that with a web app. And you have to do user registration and login. And to do that you need a database. And in my case, I use the SQL database. And of course, there are a lot of, so Sandro is taking a picture now. Sandro said, I should stand like a gorilla. So hopefully he's got it on picture. So you need a database to put your users in, and I use SQL Server or SQL database in Azure, but of course there are a lot of possibilities, so you can also use DocumentDB or MongoDB or other databases. And to restrict your API or to put security on your API, you need API management. And for your API, you need an API app. But for API management, it doesn't really matter where you put your API. So you can use an API app, but you can also use something else. And for the data for your API, I like to use DocumentDB because DocumentDB is really fast. It's much faster than SQL database, and that's because it's on solid state, and also because you don't have to store the data in tables. You rather use collection, and in the collection you store the JSON documents. But of course, you can also use SQL. The difference maybe is that when you have a lot of data or you have a lot of users, maybe DocumentDB is the better choice. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about first I'm going to talk about how to create your custom website, and I'm focusing on a couple of things. And of course, you have to do a lot more, but we only got 30 minutes, so or even less now. So focus on these bullets. And what I've used MVC to build a website, and that's mainly because I'm a back-end developer. So I'm not really used to all these new kinds of languages like Angular and all the JavaScript things. So for me, MVC is more because I'm a backend developer, is more confident. And of course, you can also use something else. And what I've stored my users in an Azure SQL database. So we're going to look at that. And also because for my sample, I want to use my own domain name. So we're also going to look at that. And when you have your own domain name, you also must have your own SSL certificates. Because normally when you have the domain name of Azure, something like my website at azurewebsites.net, you can make use of the SSL certificates from Microsoft. But now we have to use our own. And I don't have a real demo. I don't have. I did it on PowerPoint. And luckily, maybe because Michael had a really nice demo, so it's really hard to top that. So first, let's have a look at the website I've created. So yeah, what I already said, I've used an MVC template to create my web app. And the nice thing about MVC is that you can also add authentication to it. So when you look below, you see that you can add authentication. You have multiple choices for your authentication. And when you choose to add authentication, also extra screens are generated for you. So you don't have to do anything for that. For example, you have a login page and you have a register page. And what it also does when you use the MVC template and you add authentication, it generates a database for you. So what you're looking at now is SQL Server Management Studio. And below you see the database that is automatically created when you use the MVC template with authentication. And you see something about 6 tables. And these tables are automatically generated for you. And in this table I used, so someone is sneaking. What you also see is, I have a very problematic demonstration. It's going to work, hopefully. Yeah, it works? He's part of my next demonstration, so it's going to do a magic trick. So also the password is hashed, so you see here the hash password. And the nice thing about SQL Server or SQL database in Azure is that you only have to copy these tables to your Azure SQL database, and then you're done. So, and of course you have to change the web.config in Visual Studio. You have to do that also. But you only have to copy these tables, and then your web app is running in Azure, and you can log in and sign in. So for the custom domain, first you have to reserve your domain name. Well, that's obvious, I guess. And then the second thing what you have to do is that you have to map your custom domain name to the domain name in Azure. And there are a couple of ways to do it. You have 2 records to do that, and you have an A record, and now it's becoming really technical. And then you're mapping your IP address, or you have to map to the IP address of the web app. And the second choice what you have is to use a canonical name, and with the canonical name record you map to the domain name of Azure. It doesn't really, it depends a little bit on your hosting provider what you choose. And the last thing what you have to do is to add the domain name inside the Azure portal. So this is the administration page of the hosting provider I have, and I've created emergence.com, and so here I'm going to make my money with. I wanted to have a .com website because I'm going to be an international company, and I also wanted to have something with API, and that's really hard to use or to combine these two because everything with API and .com is taken. So now I have something like Emergence. It's a little bit far-fetched, I guess, but well, we have to cope, I guess. And I also bought here SSL. And I didn't know, because I'm not really a UI developer, so I didn't know what it cost, SSL. But for $15 or 15 euros, about 15 euros, you can buy SSL for your own domain name. So I find it very cheap. But in that case, you don't have subdomains. So you don't have something like portal.emergence.com. And also, here you have the records, and I choose to use an A record. So I map to the domain name, or sorry, to the IP address of of the web app in Azure. And when you use an A record, you also have to choose to use an AW verify record. And Azure uses that record to verify if you really are the owner of this domain name. So in below, the last one, you see that the AW verify record. And this is a little bit funny website. It's also on the Azure website.com that you can look at, that you can use this website to validate if your DNS is propagated. Because it can take quite some time to propagate your changes. And when you do it for the first time, you're thinking, oh, doing I something wrong? Doesn't work. And then you can use this website to validate if everything is working. And then, of course, we have to go to the Azure portal. So what you're seeing here is the web app that I've created. And when you click in the menu, and then I have to look what it is, you have to choose custom domain names in SSL, and then you can choose or add your own custom domain name. And then the second thing from what you have to do is you have to add your own certificates. So I bought already my own certificates. You get a certificate file or several files. You get a key file, you get a certificate file, and then you have to add a PFX file. And that was the only file I didn't get. So I get something like 4 files, and I didn't get a PFX file. So first I have to Bing or to Google, or both. And I have to look for, hey, how do I create a PFX file? And it appears you have to use OpenSSL, and I'm just curious, whoever uses OpenSSL? Also not many. And I didn't know OpenSSL. And OpenSSL is an open source library for SSL, and it's based on Linux. And I'm a Windows guy, so for me it was very hard to install OpenSSL. So yeah, it took me almost a day to install, and at the end it wasn't really that hard because there's also an emulator. So I'm doing this backwards. I'm trying to install OpenSSL on Windows. But in the end, I'm thinking, hey, this is taking too much, taking too much time. I'm doing something wrong here. So it appears that I have to install the emulator. And when you install the emulator, you can also choose the package for OpenSSL. So in the end, it only took me 5 minutes. But first, I try all the funny stuff to do to install it. So maybe this is the most important slide of the deck. Install OpenSSL when you want to use your own custom certificates. So this is the second part what I'm going to talk about. So now we're having our own custom website, and we're doing user registration, and we're doing login. But now what we want to do is we want to integrate that with our API management. And you can do that with delegation. So how can you do that? You have the Azure Developer Portal, and when the user tries to log in the Azure Developer Portal, it clicks on the login link, and then it's delegated to your existing website. So in your existing website, you have to configure a delegation page. So every request that comes from the Developer Portal goes to the delegation page, and then the delegation page looks at what's the type of thing you're doing or where you're clicking on, and it figures out where it has to go to. So in this case, because we're going to log in, it goes to the login page. And when the user doesn't have an account, it goes to the register page. And when you go to register your application or your user, you have to create an account also in the developer portal. So you're going to do that underwater. So that's a Dutch expression. And you can do that with the API with the REST API. So you have to create a linked account. So you have to create your user in your own database, and you have to create the same user in the developer portal. So when the user is authenticated, it goes back to the delegation page. And when the user is authenticated, you have to create an SSO link. And again, you do that with the REST API. And when you have the SSO link, when the user goes back to the developer portal, it's already logged in. So how can you do that? when you go to the management portal of API management, there you can configure it. And what you're seeing here is I clicked on the security, or in the menu I clicked on the security option, and then I go to API. And for the first I have to enable the API management REST API. So when you enable the API management REST API, you also have to add an authentication token. So with authentication, that's a hard word for Dutch. So the authentication token you need in every request you're making. And the also thing what you have to do, you have to enable a delegation. So in the delegation tab, you enable delegation. You cannot you can do that for the login, but you can also do it for the subscription of your product. Because when you have an API, you put your API in a product. You can put several APIs in a product, and for the product subscription, you can also enable that to use delegation. And we want to use delegation because we want to charge money for the API. So this is the website I've created, and I'm not a UI guy, so for me this was really hard to create that. And what I did to make it easy for myself, so I bought also a Bootstrap template. So when you're not that familiar with the UI and you make it more, a little bit more fluffy, you can use the Bootstrap template. And what I also wanted to do, because what you saw in the previous slide, is that first you go to the developer portal and then you are delegated back to your own custom website. But is it also possible to do it the other way around? Because when you're a new user, probably you don't know the developer portal, first you go to the website, and that's also possible. So in your website you can click on register, and now you have to register. So the user clicks his name, etc., and his address. And what you see here is Visual Studio. So when the user clicks on the register button, it goes back to the controller. And here you create your user. And that's already also generated for you because in a template we added authentication. So the user, you also get a piece of code that the user has created. And the only thing what you have to do is add the part that you also create the user, the same user with the same user ID that you created in the developer portal. And then you go to the next page in your website, and then what I'm doing here is I'm going to buy a product, and that's where you can make the money, of course. And when you're delegated back from, so for example, when you were still first on the developer portal and you are delegated back, then you also got the product ID. But because now I'm for the first time a user, so I don't have the product ID, so you have to get it yourself. And the funny thing is that I couldn't find the product ID on the API management portal. So what I've used, or I called the API management REST API, and in this case I used Postman, and then you get an overview of all the products you have, and you get also the IDs. So I use this ID in my website when the user clicks on the subscribe button. And when the user clicks on the subscribe button, it goes back to the account controller, the controller in your website. And what you then have to do is then you have to subscribe in the API management, you have to subscribe to the product. So again, you call the REST API management, or the REST API. And then what you need is a user ID, and you also need a product ID. And the last thing what I've done is, and when you look below, you see that you have to also enable the SSL link. And when you do that, you automatically signed in. So in this case, I'm going to the developer portal, and I'm Scott Tiger, and this is for the Oracle guys. Scott Tiger is an administrative name from the past. It's an old thing. So this is my last slide. I don't think we have time for questions. Enjoy creating your own website. Okay, thanks.